Hello and welcome back to ITWeb TV Live at Security Summit 2024. I'm joined now by advocate Jacqueline Fick, CEO of VizStrat Solutions. Jackie, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. So let's get started. I know you've been speaking a couple of times already on our stages at the Security Summit. And in our kind of pre-build-up, you've been talking to us about the cyber legislation and how you're very enthusiastic about it. So let's talk around that. We've obviously got the international picture. Let's start at the kind of the high level and then come down locally. Who do you think's got the best cyber legislation globally? Who do we kind of aspire to be, or who has the best legislation in that sense? And which countries or bodies are we working with in South Africa to kind of try and develop some good cyber legislation?
Very good question. I think in my drafting of the cybersecurity bill, I actually honed in on 14 countries that I used in the benchmarking. And why I did that was because I think there's a unique aspect to each country. Nobody has everything perfect, but if you look at some of the principles that some of these countries have, Estonia, for example, wonderful. They've just got a whole thing about e-identity. The UK I find very helpful, and they're also one of the partners that we work with very closely. And it's always easy to look at the UK because it's not a foreign concept when we look at their legislation in terms of what we have in South Africa. Mm-hmm. But each country onto its own. And if you look at some of the principles, and there are universal principles that you have across countries, it is very difficult for me to say that I do have a favorite. But yes, most definitely in terms of partnerships, the ones that I've worked with over the last few years, UNODC does a lot of work in the Africa space, but especially when it comes to the practical side of things, training, writing of legislation, policies, procedures. I've personally worked with them. And then, of course, now defunct SA-EU dialogue facility. I did quite a lot of work with them, and some that was actually mentioned on stage today by Craig Rosewarne. And one of those was, for example, to design posters for each and every police station that helps the police to see what should I be doing when somebody reports a cybercrime to me.
Awesome.
The EU also sponsored the drafting of the cybercrime master implementation plan for the police, their whole roadmap on how to deal with cyber within their organization, international protocols. And then I've also been working very closely with the UK government, with the FCDO, that have done amazing things. Under that, for example, what we've done is I have, with their assistance, been able to draft most of the cybercrime training programs for the police, but also strategic documents such as the standard operating procedures, as we call them SOPs, on how to gather and deal with digital evidence. And this is directly mandated in terms of Section 26 of the Cybercrimes Act. And that was all with the funding and help of the UK. Also, directives that we've recently done on the way that we should be dealing with digital evidence across borders. I think it's not necessary for me to say that cybercrime is a borderless crime. So if we don't join in this fight, we are definitely not going to make a dent on our own. And you might disrupt, but you're not going to get people behind bars. And it's all about your digital evidence. Sometimes I wish that we had called the Cybercrimes Act the Digital Evidence or the Electronic Evidence Act, because that's actually what it's all about. Mm-hmm. We can have as many crimes as we want. If we don't have the evidence to put people behind bars or to bring them to trial, it's not going to help much.
Yeah. So talking about the kind of the SOPs there, it was a while ago, a few years ago, I did a piece on forensic kind of auditing post-tax, all this kind of thing. Do you deal with those forensic auditors and kind of understand what they're kind of looking to achieve and how they work, and then like work that back into how the policy is drafted? Or is it the other way that you kind of set it out and then talk to them, or do you not talk to them? How does that work?
With forensic auditors, you mean the people that would examine money flows and transactions?
But also the digital forensic auditors as well.
Okay. Digital forensic investigators, yes, most definitely.
Okay.
Forensic auditors, as investigators, you would deal with them in a particular investigation because they need to examine the money flows for you. And when it comes to digital forensic people, these are the people, the lower level, we call them first responders, and they would be the people that are first on scene and that make sure that the devices that contain the digital evidence is secured.
Yeah.
There are a few keywords when it comes to digital evidence, and the first one is, am I preserving it in a way that will ensure the reliability? Secondly, the integrity of that evidence. And why? Because we need to ensure the admissibility thereof in a court of law. Mm-hmm. So when we look at the standard operating procedures, it's across the value chain, because you need to tell people, for example, a normal person that goes out first to a murder scene, and that person needs to know, if I find a cell phone there or I arrest a person on the street, what is the rules for securing it? Because unless that cell phone has been stolen, you're actually not interested in the device. You are interested in the information contained there.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, with digital evidence, you don't have a do-over. If you've messed it up, everything that you do with that phone alters the data contained on it. And once you do that, you start working on the negative side of admissibility. Sure. So if you look at the SOPs, it tells people, what should I do at the scene? How should I be gathering this evidence? And how do I hand it over? How do I bag and tag it so that I preserve this evidence? And the digital forensic people can then go and image that information, work on it, and produce eventually the evidence that I was interested in getting from that device.
Okay. You mentioned before about the posters that you've kind of been doing with SAPs, and I think that's great. Like, I was very happy to hear that, because I think one of the things that's come up in a few of the interviews that we've been doing is that there's perhaps a lack of cyber skills and cyber awareness amongst that the justice cluster kind of frontline responders. How do we kind of go beyond posters? And it's sad that you said that there was defunct or that's stopping, but how do we go about kind of raising that awareness so that it's not just a kind of small segment of the police force that kind of deals with it, but actually every kind of officer is able to kind of understand, I shouldn't be touching this phone and pressing the buttons and going through the selfies or whatever?
So the approach that we took, and this is part of the Africa Cybercrime Project program from the UK, is I actually wrote the General Awareness on the Cybercrimes Act for the recruits. And that was rolled out to all 10,000 of the recruits. And the decision was then made, that is something that's necessary and that should be known by each and every single police officer.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as you progress, lay that basis and then go further and further. Don't start with things like open source intelligence or digital forensics, because it is a food chain. If I mess up in the way that I've gathered that evidence right from the beginning, securing that cell phone, my digital forensic specialists can be as good as they can be, we're going to have a problem because it was messed up in the first instance. So general awareness, currently in the maturity that South Africa is, and especially when it comes to law enforcement, I think that general awareness is the most important thing. Mm-hmm. But I want to repeat what I said yesterday, that cybersecurity, and included in that cybercrime, is not a police problem. It's not a state security agency or a SIU problem. It's an us problem. We would not have so many cases if we raised levels of basic awareness of each and every person in this country. I always say I want to deputize people, because if they become aware, they're not as easily going to be enticed into scams. And I mean, we can talk about the most horrific stories that will have all of us crying, but how much of that can be prevented or at least mitigate it. When people, for example, let me give you this example, in these investment scams, they usually carry on over a period of time.
Yeah.
You might fall victim right in the beginning, but that continuing engagement with the people, if I can just raise that awareness that something is off here, you might lose a little money instead of all. So that basic awareness is where we need to raise our awareness for law enforcement, but also for each and every citizen in this country.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, that's something that's come up repeatedly, is the general level of cyber awareness. And I'm not sure there's a kind of easy fix to that, unfortunately. I think, there's various kind of angles, but hopefully in someday we'll kind of get there. You were involved in drafting cybersecurity bill.
Yes, I was the drafter.
And Cybercrimes Act?
So there I was involved in providing inputs at that time on behalf of all the telcos. Okay. But it was a long process and a very rewarding and fulfilling process. And I think the biggest role that I currently have fulfilled was in the implementation of that act. Okay. We can have the most beautiful laws, and believe me that the Cybercrimes Act is beautiful. Okay. And remember, it's also just in partial implementation. But the proof is in the pudding. Mm-hmm. If we do not implement and teach people how to implement, we're wasting our time. That piece of legislation is just going to gather dust.
Okay. So why do we have two different acts, and how do they differ?
So, originally, the Cybersecurity and Cybercrimes Bill was one.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yes. I think the last version was B6 of 2017. Okay. And then the two Siamese twins were split. And unfortunately, the Cybersecurity Bill was left on life support. So now we've got the Cybercrimes Act, the toddler running around already. But they were split. Mm-hmm. Personally, I wish they weren't, because if you look at cybersecurity and cybercrime, I always describe it as two parts of the same coin. Yeah. It's the good things and the bad things. Yeah. And they go together. And they also, if you put them together, they create a better understanding of what this whole thing is when things go wrong in the world of cyberspace. Mm-hmm. But the Cybercrimes Act came into partial operation on the 1st of December 2021. Important date, because one of the things that came into operation was the crimes. So anything that happened on or after 1 December, you will use the Cybercrimes Act. Any crime committed before 1 December, you're still going to go to the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. Even if it's reported later, it's about the date that that incident occurred. With the Cybersecurity Bill, we are not yet at the point that we've even gone to public comments. Right. So one of the suggestions, and I take my hat off to SSA for agreeing to that, is that we took an agile approach to the drafting of the bill, meaning that we involved key stakeholders as I was drafting. Yeah. So the benefit of that is to get views of what should be in there, what is the feeling about the operational implementation of such a bill, and then it also helps. It's not such a big surprise when it does go out for public comment. And the comments that we received was invaluable to us as a drafting team, especially what do you think about inclusion of certain concepts? As I said, lots of countries bringing the best practice, bringing the benchmarking and saying what is going to work for South Africa in terms of what we currently have, what's our level of maturity, what is our legislative frameworks look like in South Africa, and eventually what is going to make the world feel comfortable that we are a cyber safe and a cyber secure country. Yeah, for sure. I mean, the international reputation obviously does play a part. It's not necessarily strictly related to that, but PAPIR is one kind of piece of legislation that's around data protection. So once we pass the cybersecurity bill, do you think we're going to need any other cyber-related legislation? And if so, in what areas, what would be the kind of your primary or the primary focus for that? If you look internationally, there's usually 3 pillars when it comes to cybersecurity. So the one is, of course, cybersecurity measures, cybersecurity legislation. The second one is if things go wrong, do you have adequate procedural laws such as we have now with the Cybercrimes Act? And if you look, for example, at the precedent that was set by the Budapest Convention, that has to be one piece of legislation. So the other leg is data privacy. Mm-hmm. So if we have those three, we have gone a long way towards ticking the boxes. In the more developed countries, you would now find that they have specific legislation that deals with ransomware. But we have ransomware in Section 10 in the Cybercrimes Act, and it might be as we mature that we want other pieces of legislation. Besides POBIA, we also have the Critical Infrastructure Act that's also in partial operation because yes, the Cyber Security Bill will now talk about critical information infrastructure, but you can't really separate physical infrastructure from what is in cyberspace. And the other one, of course, is RICA, the Regulation Interception of Communications Act, which is also a very important party to this legal landscape. Would we need more legislation? I think there's always a need for legislation, but there's a very fine balance between legislate and regulate, especially when it comes to an environment that changes by the minute.
Yes, yeah.
And laws are difficult to change. And that's a very fine balance between what do I include in my legislation and what do I say I will address in regulations that flow from that act. So, do we need more legislation? I don't think right now when it comes to cybersecurity, but we have the opportunity to not reinvent the wheel, but take world best practice and take it into our legislation and see that it works for us.
Okay. Talking of the world,
yes,
which you just did, and you mentioned borderless as well, and let's make this our kind of final question. How do you think we would cybercrime is a borderless crime. It can be from parts of Asia, it could be from Russia, it could be from America, it could be from Pretoria. How is there a need for international kind of cooperation and international law on cybercrime, and what is happening in those regards?
So, firstly, you have the Budapest Convention from the Council of Europe, which we called it the mother of all cybercrime conventions. And South Africa was a signatory but never ratified.
Okay.
And then, of course, the next big one on cyber was the UN's Cybercrime Treaty, but that has not been finalized yet.
Okay.
So you need that general rules. And remember that any treaty can never interfere with the sovereignty of a country. So you go and you see, basically, am I complying with this? Have I got the right things in place to say to international partners, yes, things are good? Just talking about international, there are a few things in the Cybercrimes Act that's really going to help us. The first one is that, yes, evidence is one thing, but if you want evidence, you are looking at mutual legal assistance, which is a very long, very protracted system. And with digital evidence, it's fragile. People don't store it. And we are building these mechanisms in Chapter 5 of the Cybercrimes Act that now provides for us asking and other people asking us to preserve the evidence for a certain period of time until you come with this long process of mutual legal assistance. Mm-hmm. That's going to be very valuable. The other one in the Cybercrimes Act also is our designated point of contact in terms of Section 52. This is a structure in the police that is going to function as our 24/7 center for cybercrime contact. And then, of course, the National Cybersecurity Center, NCSC, that is a structure created in the Cybersecurity Bill that's going to play an important role. But again, as I said, it's all about evidence, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Jackie, that's been great to hear that there's actually work going on in this regard, and from someone who's obviously at the core of it all. That's been Advocate Jacqueline Fick from VizStrat Solutions.